afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy, and I work with the Ottawa Public Library. We're really pleased that you've joined us today. We have a very interesting topic to learn about and discuss today, considering the amount of information that we're finding out on the World Wide Web nowadays. It's very difficult to try to determine what is accurate, what is not, what you should forward on or double check. We have Matthew Johnson with us today. He's the Director of Education at MediaSmarts, which is a local Ottawa organization that promotes digital and media literacy. They offer workshops like this for schools and the broader community. So without any further ado, I'm going to let Matthew take over here. You'll see his slide up on the screen. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. It should be at the bottom of your screen. Just type a message in the Q&A. And what we're going to do is just compile the questions, and then we'll work with Matthew at the very end of the presentation to try to answer as many of them as we can. So we're not going to answer them during the presentation, just in case, you know, the next slide is about to answer what you've just asked, or we don't want to break Matthew's train of thought. We'll move through everything, and then at the very end, we'll look after that Q&A. So just pop your questions in there as you think of them. And over to you, Matthew. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And thank you to everyone who is attending. Welcome to our Break the Fake workshop. And today we're going to learn 4 easy ways to tell if something is true online. But let me start you off with a couple of examples. So to start off, which of these pictures do you think is real? It's that one. That's a peacock spider. Very brightly colored, beautiful spider, entirely real. The other one is a picture of a jaguar whose eyes have been recolored. Which of these 2 news sources do you think is real? The Buffalo News or the Buffalo Chronicle? If you don't live in Buffalo, probably not many people who are watching today do. If you haven't spent a lot of time in Buffalo, you may have no way of knowing that it is this one, the Buffalo News. The Buffalo Chronicle, some of you may know, is a bit of a notorious purveyor of fake news, literally, and it's a little unusual in that it actually gets involved more than these outlets generally do in Canadian politics. So it spread a number of fake news stories during the last Canadian election. And which of these 2 websites is real? Is the Shed at Dulwich restaurant on our left real, or the Mike the Headless Chicken Festival? Well, you may have guessed in this case that Mike the Headless Chicken is a real festival held every year. I think this year, unfortunately, it had to be postponed. But most years, there is a festival to commemorate a chicken that lived a surprisingly long time with its head cut off. The restaurant, on the other hand, was a prank that was run by a person in England. He took pictures of his shed, posted them on TripAdvisor, and managed to get it listed as the best reviewed restaurant in England, even though, of course, it was not a restaurant and did not actually exist as anything except a shed. So how many people got all 3 right? Probably not too many. Maybe you did. Maybe you were lucky. After all, each one, you had a 50-50 chance. The point being that in each case, either one of them could have been real. Either one of them could have been fake. That could just as easily have been a retinted picture of a spider. The restaurant could quite easily have been real, and the Headless Chicken Festival could have been fake. And of course, the 2 Buffalo news sources, again, if you are not familiar with Buffalo News and haven't seen one of them mentioned before, either one of them could entirely have been real. There's no easy way to spot misinformation online. And if you have just one thing that you take away, is this, that we cannot trust our eyes, we cannot trust our first impressions. It's just as easy to make a fake website as a real one. And computer graphics that were just a few years ago were limited to big budget Hollywood movies like this computer recreation of Carrie Fisher, the actress from Star Wars in Rogue One in 2016, it's now available on free smartphone apps. So you see on the right here an app called Zao, which you can get on your smartphone for free, and it will put your face into video clips. There's a user's face being put into a scene from Game of Thrones. So this technology is getting faster, it is getting better, it is getting cheaper, and so more than ever, we can't trust our eyes. Of course, most kinds of misinformation aren't high tech in that way. Most of the time, they are rudimentary, like the Buffalo Chronicle, as you saw. It doesn't look particularly expensive, but it can still be effective. Because everything on the internet is connected, it's also easy for misinformation to reach lots of people. And that's one of the things that has changed the most. We've always had misinformation. We've always had the weekly world news or whatever. But what we have now is an environment, an information environment, where misinformation can spread incredibly quickly. Sometimes people share misinformation by accident because they really think that something is true and it's not, or because they don't think that other people will take it seriously. Most of us probably have shared something we thought was real without checking. And in fact, recent research specifically around coronavirus has found that most Canadians have shared misinformation, shared something that they later learned was misinformation. We're more likely to share things that we feel strongly about, especially things that we hope are true. And that's why it's not just that we can't trust our eyes, we also can't trust our gut, because your gut is going to tell you that something is true, often because you want it to be true. But a lot of misinformation online isn't trying to get us to believe a particular thing. It's actually designed to make us doubt whether anything is true. So this example is a Black Lives Matter page, or a number, well, there were a number of them that were set up on Facebook, where both sides of a protest were actually organized by Russian misinformation groups. And so they clearly are not interested particularly in trying to spread a particular message. Most misinformation online isn't trying to get us to believe a particular thing. It's trying to make us doubt whether anything is true. That's why even seemingly harmless examples of misinformation are important. Online misinformation hasn't just made us easier to fool, it's made us more cynical. If we can't tell what's true, it feels safer to assume that everything is fake. But as we've seen very recently, that can be even worse than being fooled, because when we need to rely on good information, when we need to know what good information is, when it's something around public health or other health choices, when it's something that might determine how we vote, being able to determine that something is true is just as important, if not more important, as being able to recognize information that's false. Critical thinking isn't about doubting everything. It's about learning how to find out what's true, because only truth can break the fake. In this workshop, we're going to look at 4 steps that you can use to find out if something is true or not. Use fact-checking tools, find the original source, verify the source, and check other sources. Once you've learned them, none of these will take more than 2 minutes to do, and some will take just 10 seconds. Just one of them will usually get you the answer you need, but it's good to know how to do all 4. I'm going to show you a few different ways to do each one, and then you'll get a chance to try it out. Sometimes a single search can break the fake if a professional fact checker has already done the work for you. Thanks to computers, as we've seen, it's easy to make fake pictures. And a lot of times people will share them without knowing that they're fake. Take these photos of the pyramids that were shared by two popular Twitter accounts, Picology and History Lovers Club. They both look pretty real, don't they? Or do they both look fake? Both of these accounts have shared plenty of fake and misleading photos. Now, we could do the detective work ourselves, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, but it's easier to let somebody else do it. Let's start with the grandparent of all fact-checking sites, Snopes.com. They've been around since the early days of the internet, and they fact-check all kinds of things. When we go to the site and we search for Zeppelin over pyramid, we can see they've already confirmed that this photo is for real. When we search Snopes for pyramid clouds, we found they've also checked this photo out and found that it's false. There are also fact checkers that specialize in different topics like health or politics or different countries. Another way you can see if someone's debunked a false or misleading news story is to do a search for the topic of the story and add the words fake or hoax to your search. Now, this can be a bit risky because anyone can say that something is a hoax, so you need to make sure the people debunking it are reliable. To be sure a fact checker is reliable, you can see if they've signed on to the International Fact-Checking Network's Code of Principles. That's a good sign that they're not there with an axe to grind. They're not representing a particular political party or a particular point of view. They really are involved honestly in fact-checking. One thing we've also done is we've made a custom search engine that you can use at this address to search all of these. Now you'll see at the top the address is bit.ly/fact-search. Now if you're not familiar with bit.ly, it's a great service that lets you shorten links. So when you make a custom Google search, the actual web address is way too long to type out. So we shortened it, and it's just for this one is just bit.ly/fact-search. We'll be using bit.lys throughout this presentation because again, they're a quick way to get where you're going. So this one actually searches 8 different fact checkers at the same time. It searches Agence France Presse Canada, Associated Press Fact Check, Snopes, FactScan, PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, Washington Post Fact Checker, and Hoaxeye. And it also only searches those. And that's one of the great things about a custom Google search, as we'll see, is that it limits your results. And so you know that you're not getting something from somewhere else. And if you're not 100% sure about the reliability of any one of these, you have the other 7 to compare it to. So you're going to have your first exercise now. This is the easiest one, so it didn't take us long to get there. It's an exercise that'll show you just how quickly you can find out if something is true or not. This video of Toronto Raptors fans cheering when Golden State Warriors player Kevin Durant got injured was seen and shared more than 1 million times on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. And you can see down at the bottom, if you want to see the original post, you can do bit.ly/Durant cheer. It'll take you right there. Take a few minutes and find out if it's true using the fact-checking skills that we've just covered. So that should have been a pretty easy one. It's okay if you didn't quite get to the end. What do people think? Was that true or not? And how did you find out? Think about the steps that you took, how easy or difficult it was to get to an answer. Did you get to an answer? Well, there are a couple of different ways we can do it. So we can get the answer by doing a search with the word hoax or fake added. So you can see here, but Kevin Durant, you don't have to have that in quotation marks. Putting it in quotation marks means that it's going to search for those two words in that order. Injury, Toronto, bar, cheering, fake. Now, we don't always need that many search terms, but here we want to make sure that we're getting the most relevant results. And you can see right here, our very first two headings, US media spreads fake video showing Raptors fans cheering Durant, and we fact-checked a fake video of Raptors fans cheering for an injury. So already we've got, from that, we've got two ways of doing it, or we can put in the same search for our custom fact-checker search. And here we get fact-check AFP is giving us the result. Either one leads us eventually to fact-check AFP, where we can see the video is a fake. The original was actually from a soccer game in 2016, and footage of the basketball game on the screen has been edited in. So that was easy to find out. Probably once you know how to use either any fact checker or our fact checking search, you can find out that that was fake in about 10 seconds. But Snopes, if you went to Snopes, you would have seen that they didn't have anything on this story. And that shows you that just because a fact checker hasn't debunked something doesn't mean it's true. If nobody else has fact-checked a story for you, we move on to the next step, and that is find the original source. Because it's so easy to copy and share things online, it's important to find out where something originally came from before you decide whether or not to trust it. Someone might have shared it with you on social media, or a news story might be based on someone else's story. So really what matters is not how a story got to you, but where it originally came from. One easy way to find the original source is to use a search engine. We might wonder if this post that seems to show a US senator displaying a picture of Aquaman to the US Congress is real. As we already saw, pictures are easy to fake, and pictures where someone is holding a sign are especially easy, because you just have to change what's on the sign. It's not even a deep fake. It's the easiest form of photo manipulation in the world. So we can do a search for his name, that's Mike Lee. Again, we're putting it in quotes to make sure that those words are searched in that order. Add Aquaman and C-SPAN, because that's where the picture supposedly came from. And then we open this link to C-SPAN in a new tab. We always want to open links in new tabs so that if it doesn't pan out, we can go back to our search quickly. We don't have to back arrow to it. And we see that it actually does come from C-SPAN's footage of the US Congress. So that is a real story. Mike Lee really did display this photo of Aquaman on the floor of the US Congress. He also displayed a photo of Luke riding the Tauntaun from The Empire Strikes Back, and a bunch of other extremely silly things to make some kind of point that I don't really know, but it actually did happen. Whether it was a good idea or not, I don't know. Whether he was serious or not, I don't know, but it actually did happen. So now we know it's true. Another way to find out if a photo like this one of astronomer Carl Sagan is real is to do a reverse image search. So that's what I was talking about a couple of minutes ago when I said doing the detective work about those photos. So how we do a reverse image search. We click on the image, then you right click, depending on what kind of machine you have. So you may have to double tap it, or you may have to tap it gently if you're using a Mac. Anyway, you do whatever you do to do a non-normal click, and you select copy image location if you're using Chrome or Firefox, or I think Safari. Next, we go to tineye.com. Now, there are a number of different reverse image searches that you can use. Google Chrome has one built in. There's Yandex. There are a couple of others. TinEye is my favorite, and I'll show you why in a moment. So now we paste in the address, and you can do that either by, again, right-clicking or the equivalent on your device and selecting paste, or on most devices, there's a keyboard shortcut. It's Control V on a Windows machine. I think it's Apple V on Macs, and so on. So one of the reasons why I like TinEye is we can change the sort so that we can sort by oldest first. So we want to see what is the earliest version of this photo and how does it compare to the one we found. So if you remember, the one we found said, don't forget no billboards in space. We look at the oldest first, and here it is clearly a different photo. The sign has been changed. Everything else is the same. He's actually holding up the inscription that was put on the Voyager 2 spacecraft. In case aliens ever found it, we wanted to have something to explain ourselves, explain why we were littering up the universe with space junk. And so here is what he was involved in designing to go on that probe. So we see that the photo that we were looking for is fake. It's been changed since the original. But even if something you see is real, it may not be what the source that shared them says they are. So this photo, for example, is not actually Charlie Chaplin, but an actress named Thelmy Talia, and it wasn't taken in the 1920s or 1930s. It was actually taken in the 1950s, and it was taken with, it was just taken with black and white film, and I will slow down, thank you. So that tells us that the content of a photo is not the only important thing, the context is also important. And that's why we need to follow links in a story until we get to where information actually came from. So again, finding the original source means finding where a story originated. So here, for instance, we can see this is a Huffington Post article. But we don't really care whether a Huffington Post is a reliable source or not, because in fact it's based on a New York Times article. So we can double check, we can follow those links to the New York Times, and it's quoting something that someone said on Twitter, and we can follow that. So following links, that is one of the great things about the internet, is that we can follow links. So if we read in a newspaper that somebody said something, or if we read in a newspaper that something is being reprinted from the New York Times or wherever, we have no way of double checking that. If I read that in my newspaper and I want to make sure, is that really what the New York Times said? Was it changed in some way? Well, I have to actually go and get the New York Times. But online, we can just follow the link. That's especially important on social networks, where we usually pay more attention to who shared something instead of where it originally came from. So you can see on Facebook, who shared something with us is much more prominently placed than the original source of an article. Now, if there aren't links, sometimes they won't link to where something came from. So then we look for phrases like the New York Times reported in this article here, or the word source at the top or bottom of a story. If something presents you with facts or statistics but doesn't tell you where they came from, there's no way to know if you can trust them. So here again, it's an article we might encounter on Huffington Post. Maybe we trust Huffington Post, maybe we don't. It doesn't really matter though in this case, because this is actually a Reuters story. And if you're familiar with the news service Reuters, you know they're pretty reliable. Certainly they're unlikely to be really unreliable. So here's a story from Bleacher Report that claims that breakdancing and skateboarding are going to become official Olympic events. Now already that might get us a little skeptical. That seems a little hard to believe. When we scroll down a bit though, we see it's based on earlier stories from Reuters and the Associated Press. So in fact, if that's true, it is probably a true story. Now, we want to make sure that Bleacher Report is giving us an accurate report of what these sources said. So to do that, we follow those links. Once again, right-click them to open them in new tabs, and we see that this story is true. So here we are on Reuters again. And we see, yes, breakdancing is among the sports being given a provisional green light for Paris 2024. We don't know yet if they're actually going to be there, but the original story was basically true. But we did to find out that that was the case because we had no reason to trust or distrust Bleacher Report. We had to follow the links to the original source. But we also have to make sure that a story really is from that source. A lot of websites, including many reliable ones like Reuters, carry sponsored content, paid links to stories on other sites. So the article down in the middle there about breakdancing is absolutely true, and it is from Reuters. But you can see along the top, there's a whole bunch of ads for sponsored stories, and there are a whole bunch of ads for sponsored stories down the right. And we need to know, you need to understand that those are not from Reuters. Those are ads. People are paying to post those. And I really do wish that reliable sources like Reuters wouldn't run ads that are confusing like that people could misinterpret as being their stories, but they do. So we have to learn to tell the difference between which ones are actual Reuters stories and which ones are sponsored content. And you can see at the bottom under each one, there is a little, in teeny tiny gray text, it says where it's actually from. If there aren't links in the story, we can do a search for the topic plus the sources that are given. So let's say that that story in Bleacher Report said the story was from Reuters, but didn't provide a link. So then we can add breakdancing Olympics Reuters, because it's a story about breakdancing in the Olympics, and we want to find out, did Reuters actually run this story? And we see, as you can see at the top, that yes, it takes us directly to the same story. We can also use reverse image search to see if a photo really is what it seems to be. That is to say, if the context has been changed. So according to this tweet, this photo shows a terrible mess left behind after an environmentalist protest. But following the same steps we learned a few minutes ago shows the picture is actually from a concert in 2014. So the photo is absolutely real. It hasn't been altered in any way. It hasn't been faked. It's just being presented in an entirely misleading context. And I would say that that's probably the most common form of misinformation online, is when something is not fake, but it's being presented in a misleading context. So here it's totally unrelated to what the source claimed. They said it was from an environmental protest, but in fact, it's from a rock concert. Now it's your turn. Did explorers really find hundreds of animals that were thought to be extinct at a place called the Lost City of the Monkey God? Take a few minutes to find the original source of this story. So start with bit.ly/monkeygod. Check that out. You'll see this article or this tweet from all that's interesting. Take a couple of minutes to find the original source of the story and see if it's true or not. So, what do people think? Is it true or not? And how did you find out? If you found an answer, you can take a minute to post it in the chat. Yeah, okay. I have a hand, see a hand raised. I'm not sure how I respond to that. Two raised hands. Okay, 3. All right. I don't think I can give. I don't think I can give the floor to other people. So I think if people want to respond, you need to do it in the chat. Unless one of my co-hosts can correct me.
That's true, actually, Matthew. We don't have a way to easily unmute the participants. Yeah. You can pop it into the chat, okay?
Okay. Yeah, okay. Yes. Okay, so if you do change chat to all panelists and attendees, then everyone else will see your answer. So under the 2, just click on it and switch to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, it's just the panelists that see it. All right, well, I'm going to go on just in the interest of time. So it probably didn't take you very long to see that this story was true. Now, we have no reason to think that all that's interesting is necessarily a reliable source. But when we scroll down a bit, we can see the story actually came from The Independent, which is a well-known British newspaper. So there's no reason to think that it's not true. But what if we didn't know whether The Independent was a reliable source or not? What if we've never heard of The Independent? How do we know that is the real Independent website anyway? Well, that's what we're going to look at with our 3rd step, verify the source. Whether we're looking at a website, a photo or video or a news story, what really matters is whether or not the people who originally created it are trustworthy. We can't always confirm that something is false, but if the source isn't reliable, we have no reason to believe it. This is the only time when it matters what order you do the steps in. Reliable sources do sometimes share things that turn out not to be true, and unreliable sources sometimes share things that are true. That's why we shouldn't bother verifying a source until we know for sure it's where the information originally came from. So there'd really be no reason, for instance, to fact check Bleacher Report to find out if that story about breakdancing was true, because it wasn't really a Bleacher Report story, it was a Reuters story. There'd be no particular reason to fact check All That's Interesting, because it wasn't from All That Was Interesting. They were just sharing a link from The Independent. What matters is, are Reuters and The Independent reliable? They are. How do we know that, though? Suppose we've never heard of either of them. When we find out the original source, we need to ask 3 questions. First, does this source really exist? We saw earlier how easy it is to make fake pictures online, and it's just as easy to make a fake website or social media profile. Second, are they who they say they are? It's also easy to impersonate people online and to create imposter sites or social network accounts. Finally, are they reliable? Anybody can claim to be an expert online, so you need to make sure that there are good reasons to think that someone is a reliable source. These days, it's easy to make websites that look just as slick and professional as anything that's out there. In fact, some trustworthy sources may look less professional than fake sites because they haven't put time or money into updating their website. A lot of government agencies, for instance, have old websites that haven't been updated in a long time, or at least the look and feel hasn't been updated. Museums frequently will have old-looking websites, even universities. So this is, as the flashing text will tell you, this is the actual Yale School of Art website. It looks like it hasn't been updated in terms of the look since 1995 or so, but it is the real one. So we can't be we can't put too much weight on how something looks. People who spread misinformation on purpose often invent local newspapers or TV news stations. This kind of source seems trustworthy because most of us aren't likely to have heard of a paper or TV station in a different city or country. If you're not from Buffalo, again, you don't know what the real Buffalo newspaper is. If you've never been to Victoria, I told you that the Victoria Times Colonist, or here we have the Courier Mail. So this could be real, it could be fake. As it happens, this is a real Australian newspaper, but there's nothing here that would tell us that it's real one way or another. We have to do a little research. So how do we do that? I'll give you an example. Here are two websites that claim to be from Sherbrooke, Quebec, the Sherbrooke Times and the Sherbrooke Record. Which one is real? Both of them have an About Us or a Contact Us page with a street and an email address and the names of people who work there. But then all that is easy to fake. Just make that stuff up. Instead, let's go to Wikipedia and see if there's an article there about the Sherbrooke Record. You don't actually have to go to Wikipedia to search. You can just put what you're looking for in the search box and add Wikipedia, and it'll go right there. From the Wikipedia article, we can see the Sherbrooke Record has been around for more than a century, and there's no reason to think that it isn't a reliable source. If we really want to be sure, we can click on View History, that's the tab at the far right next to the Search Wikipedia box, and we can see how long this article has existed, because that way we know if this article has been around for 10 years, we know it hasn't just been created to make us believe a hoax. How about the Times? Well, there isn't an article about it in Wikipedia, but that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't real. Wikipedia is written by volunteers, so a lot of things don't have entries, and that's especially true here in Canada. Canada is really underrepresented on Wikipedia, and so there are a lot of Canadian sources, a lot of Canadian newspapers, a lot of Canadian people that are not necessarily on Wikipedia or else have an article that's called a stub, a very short article. So let's do a search on Google for the Sherbrooke Times. Again, put it in quotes so it looks for those two words in order. Here we find the only results we can find are the website itself, its Twitter account, and articles pointing out that it's a fake. So now we can say with a fair amount of confidence that it is not a real source. It's also easy to pretend to be someone else online. So once you know a source really exists, you need to find out if what you're looking at really came from them. Did Toronto police really put out a warning on Twitter about a man in a Spider-Man costume webbing streetcar lines? Some social networks like Twitter and Instagram verify users by putting a blue check mark next to their name. That doesn't necessarily mean they're a reliable source. And that's a really important thing to understand. The blue check mark by itself does not mean a source is reliable. What it does mean is that a source is who they say they are. So they have verified to Twitter that they are who they claim to be. But in this case, it means they are a real Toronto police account, and that means that this story is true. It's a bit harder to make sure that you're on the right website. People have made fake versions of real websites like The Guardian and the CBC that look almost exactly like the real thing. So what you're looking at here are fake versions of these websites, and they're almost impossible to tell. It's almost impossible to tell that they're fake. There are things that are harder to fake though. A web address by itself doesn't tell you if a site is reliable. So one common misconception is that sites with .org addresses are more trustworthy than ones that don't have with other types like .com or .ca. That's not true. Anyone can get a .org address, but the web address can tell you if you're on an organization's real website. So if you're looking for, to find out if this is a real CBC page, you want to make sure that cbc.ca is at the beginning of the web address. Here, in this case, we want to know we're on the real UNESCO website. We've got to make sure is unesco.org the actual UNESCO address, and it is. If we are satisfied that a source is real and is who they say they are, now we have to find out whether they're trustworthy. For sources of general information, like newspapers, that means asking if they have a process for making sure they're giving you good information, and if they have a good track record of doing it. This becomes important when you're looking at sources that aren't fake, but may give you only part of a story, or may not have high standards in making sure that what they post is accurate. Now, unreliable sources sometimes share things that are true, and as we can see here, even reliable sources can make mistakes. In general, though, if you see a story from a source that you know is reliable, you can assume it's probably true. Let's look at another pair of newspapers, the Washington Times and the Washington Post. They're both real newspapers, and neither one is entirely unreliable, but one is more reliable than the other. There are signs we can look for to decide how reliable a news source is. How often do they make mistakes? If they do make mistakes, do they admit them and publish corrections? Are they willing to publish things that their owners or their readers wouldn't agree with? If we look up the Washington Post on Wikipedia, we can see it's been around since 1877 and has won 47 Pulitzer Prizes for journalism. Now, it's not perfect. They published a few stories that turned out to be inaccurate, which they've retracted and corrected publicly. But overall, it has a good track record. The Washington Times has also been around for a while, since 1982, but their track record isn't as good. Most of the Wikipedia article is about times they've spread misinformation about everything from the ozone layer to secondhand smoke. That doesn't mean the Times is an entirely unreliable source or that the Post never makes mistakes, but it does mean that most of the time you'll do a lot better trusting the Post. For more specialized sources, you want to ask whether they're experts or authorities on that topic. Being an expert is more than just being a doctor, a scientist, or a professor. Make sure they're an expert in the right field. A cardiologist would be an expert in treating your heart, but not on vaccines. Some sources, like certain professional groups or government agencies, are recognized authorities on particular topics. What they say carries more weight than any single expert in the field, and a lot more than a person or group who isn't an authority. But remember, anyone can call themselves a university, even if they're not an accredited academic institution and don't offer certifications or diplomas. And anyone can call themselves an institute on the internet. So again, you cannot believe what people tell you about themselves. You have to double check. This news story on how to get cheaper flights is based on a survey by an organization called Skyscanner. The advice in it, including the tip to book through a travel website instead of directly from an airline, comes from Alex Astania, one of Skyscanner's travel industry experts. But are they really an authority, and is Astania really an expert? Well, a search for Skyscanner shows us that they are a travel website, while a search for Astaniev's name shows he's actually their product manager. Remember, of course, that a LinkedIn page, like any other social network account, is easy to fake, so you'll want at least one more piece of evidence. But now we can see that Skyscanner is not an authority, and Astaniev is not an expert. Now, take a couple minutes and give it a try. Here are two similar looking groups, the American Academy of Pediatrics at aap.org and the American College of Pediatricians. Both of them claim to represent American pediatricians. Which one are we more likely to trust? Take a couple of minutes and find out. Oops. So, what do people think? Which one of these is more reliable, and how could we find out? Now, I gave you the two websites, but in fact, that was a little bit misleading because the first thing you want to do in finding out which of these is reliable is not necessarily go to their actual website. Both of them claim to represent American pediatricians, and both have professional-looking websites that provide lots of general information. But if we do a search for the AAP and scroll past the result for their own website to the Wikipedia entry, we can see they have 64,000 doctors as members. A search for the ACP shows they have just 500 members, and as a result, a much weaker claim to be an authority on children's health. Looking more closely shows us the ACP is not just unreliable because it's not an authority. Like Skyscanner, it also has a strong bias. The whole reason its members split from the AAP was because they were opposed to letting gay and lesbian parents adopt children. It's important not to mix up authority and bias. Someone who is actually an expert on something will probably have stronger opinions about it than someone who isn't, but they'll be better informed opinions too. The difference is that the AAP's positions, which are on everything from car seats to when the school day should start, are based on the expertise of their members, whereas the ACP's are based on their beliefs about sexuality. In other words, the AAP starts with the evidence and gets their positions from that. The ACP starts with their positions and looks for evidence to support them. Our last step, check other sources, can sometimes be the last one you do, but it could also be the first one. Like using fact-checking tools, it's a quick way of sifting out bias and finding out whether something like our news story is for real. Did this politician really do a Facebook Live video with a cat face filter on? If we do a search for Pakistani politician cat filter and switch to the news tab, we see that the story was covered by many different news outlets, from Global News in Canada to the BBC. In this step, we're not worried about the reliability of a single source. Instead, we're looking for consensus among mostly reliable news sources that something actually happened. The news tab is better than the main search for this because it's more curated. Again, a lot of times when you're doing a search, what's most important is to limit what you're searching rather than searching the entire internet. Now, not every source that's included in the news search on Google is perfectly reliable, but they are all news outlets that really exist. So the Washington Times might be in there, but the Buffalo Chronicle won't be. This step is also important for getting context, making sure you're getting the whole story. And that's why it's great to look at multiple sources. Remember, again, all sources, even the most reliable ones, make mistakes sometimes, but reliable ones correct them. Consulting other sources can help you find out if the first place that you saw something might have been leaving something out. This is a good way of dealing with the possible bias in any one source. So if you look at a bunch of different news stories from different outlets, particularly if some of them maybe are coming from a different country or from a very different point of view, then you get a more balanced picture. You can also use this step to find out whether something fits with what most of the experts on that topic agree, what's called the consensus view. One of the most important skills in verification is recognizing what is consensus on a topic. In fields like medicine, science, and history, consensus has been built up over time, with each new piece of evidence tilting the scales in its favor. Now, something that goes against the consensus may turn out to be right, but it needs more and better evidence to outweigh the consensus. So a single new piece of evidence is unlikely to totally overturn the existing consensus. It's really, really powerful. And while it's generally good to give both sides of a story, including views that experts agree aren't right can actually spread misinformation. So an article on the pyramids, for example, doesn't have to mention that some people think they were built by aliens, because that's so far outside of the consensus held by scientists and historians and archaeologists and everyone else who studies pyramids. News outlets and Wikipedia aren't always the best place to look for consensus on health and science, though, because the people who are writing the articles often aren't experts. For those topics, you want to turn to sources that you know are authorities. So here's a video that claims the North Pole is moving. We've made a custom search, another one, bit.ly/science-search, that looks just at sources whose writers are experts in the fields they write about. And I should mention all of these custom searches that I've talked about and tip sheets explaining all of this material can be found at breakthefake.ca, which is the website for our Break the Fake campaign, and you can download them, and there's lots of other great stuff there as well. So a quick search on our custom search for North Pole moving tells us that while not every detail in the video might be true, it is true the magnetic pole is shifting. Now you can use this step yourself together with the last one by building your own toolbox of sources that you've confirmed are reliable. So you can create your own custom Google search engine of 10 news outlets that you feel are reliable, that you verified yourself. Or if there's a particular topic that you're interested in, maybe you're interested in sports, and you want to weed out ones that are not reliable sources, you want to only search reliable sources to find out if a sports story is true, you can create a custom Google search that searches just those sources. Now it's your turn. According to this article in the Express, scientists at NASA have said we're heading into a solar minimum, which may cause a mini ice age. Take a couple minutes to use the skills we've covered in this step to find out whether or not that's true. And there's to find the original article, you can go to bit.ly/minimum ice. So, what's the story and how did you find out? We can check this with all three of the different skills we've covered in this step, though each one would give you the answer by itself. If we do a news search for solar minimum ice age, we find that most of the results are just for this story in the Express. And all of the other ones are sources you've probably never heard of. If no other sources are covering a story, it's probably not really news, or at the very least, you should wait and see. So a couple of months ago, some of you may remember, there was the story, of course, about Kobe Bryant dying in a helicopter crash, and for a long time, the only source that was reporting that was the gossip website TMZ. Even when other news outlets started covering that story, they were just republishing or linking back to the TMZ story. Now, it turned out, of course, that that story was true, but until there was independent confirmation, until other sources were reporting it, it was better not to share it. We can also quickly check the Wikipedia article on solar minimum. So you go to Wikipedia and you press Control F. And there's some version of Control F on every browser. And what it does is it searches the website that you're on. I think it's Apple F or Option F on Macs, but on Chrome, on Firefox, on Edge, it's Control F. And then you type in what you're looking for on that web page, just like if you were using a Word document. And here we can see on the article about solar minimum, the words ice age don't appear. If we want to take another minute and browse the article, we'll learn that the term solar minimum refers to sunspots and solar flares, not temperatures. And finally, a search of our expert sources using that custom search engine we created to search just science sources shows us that while the solar minimum is real, it won't result in cooler weather down on Earth. So that story is false. So let's wrap up with a final test. Have people really found rice with plastic mixed up in it? And is this beautiful lake actually a toxic waste dump? For each one, pick which of the steps you've covered you think will be the quickest way to verify it. So once again, those 4 steps were: use fact-checking tools, find the original source, verify the source, and check other sources. Pick the one in each case that you think is likely to work the best, try it. If that doesn't work, go on to another one. Shouldn't take you more than 2 minutes. And there are the links at the bottom. There's bit.ly/plastic and rice and bit.ly/waste link. So there are a few different ways we can fact check each of these. But in each case, there's one quickest way. Several fact-checking sites have already debunked the plastic rice story, so we can find out that that's false probably in 10 seconds. For the second story, we just have to follow the links to the original source to see that it's from the New York Times, and so is probably true. Just to be sure, we can check the web address to make sure this is the real New York Times site. It is. Now that you've learned all the steps, it probably didn't take you more than a minute to check both of those. That's good, because for misinformation to spread, people like us have to share it. That's why we have to take these steps to double check before we share anything we see online every time, because only you can break the fake. All right, so thank you all for holding on. Thank you for your kind attention, and thank you for holding on to any questions you may have had. I'm happy to take questions. I've got the chat window open, and I also have the Q&A window open. So let me know if you have any. If you don't, thank you so much for your time and attention. It's been a pleasure to talk about this.
Thanks so much, Matthew. That was really a lot of information for an hour. That's wonderful. We'll just keep an eye on that chat for a minute. But in the meantime, I'd just like to say thanks so much for joining us today. Obviously, with the World Wide Web, information is so much easier to find, but it's also really important to vet the source because you may be finding the wrong information, as we've all learned. And it's also really easy to be fooled, apparently, so important to stop passing on inappropriate or wrong information. I know I've posted things or shared things on Facebook in the past that I thought looked completely legitimate and had people message me back and say, ooh, check Snopes. So we've all been caught, I think, before. It's very, very important. So thanks so much for sharing all of that information with everybody. Did we see any questions in the Q&A? No, just lots of thank yous. That's wonderful. Perfect. Excellent. All right, well, I hope everybody enjoys the rest of this beautiful sunny day in Ottawa. And again, Matthew, thanks so much for joining us and for putting those links in the chat. And thanks so much to MediaSmarts for this presentation.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you so much for setting it up. And it's always a pleasure to talk about this topic, which is very near and dear to my heart.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.